Ellie, and welcome everyone on this Tuesday afternoon in December. Thank you so much for taking the time because I know it gets very busy in schools. My name's Eva McManaman. I'm Senior Strategy Manager for English at Pearson, and we are very excited to be welcoming you all here for this event. What does a curriculum and assessment review mean for English? And there is a lot in the review, and a lot of it is related to English. So I'm really, really pleased to have with me Debra Myhill, Chris Curtis, and Yamina Bibi, who you'll be listening to rather than listening to me, as they will give different viewpoints about the curriculum and assessment review and where we might go next in our departments and as we think about the future of English. Okay, so I don't want to hold up time because I think there's a lot to be said. And if you have any questions at any time, please do put them in the chat. If there's anything that you want to raise or respond to, please go ahead and have it in the chat. And if you have any private messages, you can use Q&A instead. So Deborah is going to be focusing on what the findings mean for English as a subject. Okay, looking at it on that level, overall thinking holistically about English. Whereas Chris is going to be thinking about it in terms of the English classroom, that kind of head of department, what's actually happening in the classroom and where things might be affected or changed by the car. And Yamina is going to be taking on the, it's a hard task, thinking about what it means for students of English, kind of thinking about how, those aspects of the car might impact and improve the experience for all our students. So different perspectives. I think there's going to be a lot of interesting points made. So I don't want to kind of take any longer other than to hand over to Debra Myhill, Professor of Education at the University of Exeter, for her perspectives on the car.
Thank you, Eva, and thank you to everyone for coming to this afternoon and have this chance to think this all through. I'm dividing my response really into two halves. One relates to what I felt the positive messages that come out of the review report, and then the second part of what I want to talk about is really some of my concerns or questions or caveats around those positives. So if I just start, generally, I mean, my main feeling about the report overall as I read it was a strong sense of, my goodness, a lot of these things are going in a new and a different and a positive direction, particularly the emphasis on the high quality inclusive curriculum, the recognition of social justice, inclusion and diversity, and also the recognition of the importance of arts and arts education. And then coming down to the English specific sections, um, one of the things there that I thought was really encouraging was recognizing that what's specified in the programs of study doesn't necessarily have to define everything that goes in an English lesson, that the curriculum can include time for activities that are at the choice of the teacher or the school and are not necessarily specified for the curriculum. And that sense of a explicit recognition that the curriculum isn't everything, I thought was really important. I thought the changes to GCS, the proposed changes to GCSE really are very positive, particularly that removing that duplication across the two GCSEs and that the heavy emphasis on literature, which I know has caused a lot of problems for many students and for schools, and that making a clearer distinction between GCSE, literature and language. And I welcome the emphasis on language in its own right, that there was such a strong move 10 or 15 years ago with the English language A level and the complementarity of literature and language. And it's good to see that emphasis on language really back there in the centre of how they're thinking about GCSEs. I also completely welcome the emphasis on diversifying the nature of the reading that students have access to, and making sure that students read texts that represent their own experiences and the experience of diverse readers and diverse contexts. That's something I think that has somewhat narrowed over recent years. So that's a really good thing to see. Also, of course, the recognition of the importance of oracy, which kind of got lost a bit in the 2013-14 curriculum, particularly since it was sort of removed to a sideline. Those of you who know me and my research on writing and grammar won't be surprised that I'm really pleased with the recommendations of grammar, where they want to move away from just identifying theoretical constructs by name and emphasizing using and applying grammar. And they talk about grammar in use, not grammar in theory. And for me, I hope what that's signaling is no more decontextualized exercises, which don't really add to students' understanding of what it means to be a reader or what it means to be a writer. I also welcomed the more extended writing tasks that they're advocating, which draw on a broader range of genres. And likewise, the reference to media and digital literacy, ephemeral text, multimodality, that is a really positive thing, because I think in many ways our current curriculum is a little bit behind the curricula in some other countries where the importance of media and digital literacy and multimodality has been well recognised for many, many years. And I was really pleased to see the recognition embedded in that is the way in which English can play a key role in helping students to become critical readers of things like social media and fake news. So overall, my response to that first reading of the report is that the mood music of the report is more inclusive, more modern, and a richer view of what English is. Then, if I think a little bit more, I do have some concerns, not necessarily specifically about what it says, but particularly around how this will translate into practice and into the revised curriculum. So, my fundamental concern really is that what emerges in the curriculum might not match up to the spirit of the report. And to an extent that, there are aspects of the government response to the report which either encourage me or make me feel, oh no, I'm not sure that this is quite what was meant by the report. And in a way, all of those positive things that I've said could not play out in the way that we hope they would when they move into being specified in the curriculum. So, just for example, I won't go through all of them again, but just that core idea of the curriculum, the specified programs of study not necessarily being the whole curriculum for English, and there being time for English activities not specified, does seem great. But from the pragmatic view of the classroom, you have to ask, will there be time for that kind of activity? The fundamental question that's always a bit of a chicken and egg situation is, what is not assessed is often not taught. And if something's not specified or not assessed, is it suggesting that it's of less value or less important? Likewise, the recognition of the importance of oracy. It's never a strong definition of what is meant by oracy. We know there are lots of different ways of thinking about it. And my hope would be that it isn't only about standard spoken English, but it's about the many, many different ways in which we use talk to communicate, but also the way we learn through talk. So it's not just talk as an object study, but talk as the medium for study. Again, with the grammar, that phrase that's in the report, grammar in use, not grammar in theory, is actually slightly ambiguous when you really think about it. I read that as hooray, this means we've got to look at real texts, have real purposes for why we're looking at grammar. And it does say, shouldn't be about identifying theoretical constructs, but the response from the government does talk about the DFE writing framework supporting this. And yet I would argue that some of the decontextualized exercises in the writing framework counter this idea of using and applying grammar, and particularly the idea that there's a purpose for why you're studying grammar rather than simply identifying things or doing grammar dexterity exercises. So I'm really hoping that the way that translates will actually become a fruitful way of thinking about language and would complement that new emphasis on language in the GCSE. I am encouraged by the DFE response, which says we agree with the review's findings that there are opportunities to teach grammar in a way that better enables pupils to master composition and write well, and addresses the widespread concern that grammar is often taught in isolation rather than the purpose for being used effectively in writing. So I think there are signs of hope in that this could go in the right direction. But for me, everything rests on what happens in that transfer from the recommendations of the Francis report through that DFE government response to it, and then through to the curriculum development and curriculum writing processes, which are now going to take place to operationalize, as it were, the principal ideas that have been represented there. But I am always optimistic. So I end this with the sense that what I would love to see is a new curriculum for English, which is more inclusive, more modern, and has that richer view of what English is. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deborah. I've got a cheeky question. Obviously, you talked about writing and this emphasis on the use of language rather than
Yeah.
learning bits of grammar out of context. One of the lines in the review was about broader forms of writing, encouraging a broader range of writing for GCSE.
Yeah.
I was just
Yeah.
wondering what you felt would be useful types of writing for our students to be exhibiting kind of during their GCSE? What do you think could be a broader range?
Well, I think instinctively, I hate limiting it. In that, I think, for example, creating your own multimodal texts is a really broad range of writing. And some of the ways I think perhaps of looking critically at social media and fake news might be playing around with the ways in which you can do that. How do you what are the ways in which you communicate through social media? I do think there's more scope for the creative, imaginative aspects of writing, writing for self as well as writing for others. But I would really say that breadth is the key word rather than defining the breadth, moving away. I think because of that huge emphasis and weight of content in the literature coverage at GCSE, the writing that isn't about writing about literary texts or texts is the bit that there's been so little time for. Teachers just haven't had the space to do that, and giving children more opportunities. And of course, what it might create is more opportunity for choice about what to write about and kinds of writing to do, because we know that one of the most demotivating things for young people as writers is that loss of autonomy, loss of agency over what they're going to write about. So for me, it really is not about specifying the breadth, but about recognizing that there is enormous breadth out there and they should have those opportunities.
Thank you. I'm sure, I mean, if Chris or Yamina have anything that they want to kind of ask or raise, please do so, or kind of we can reflect on all three kind of contributions at the end. And if anyone's got anything to ask in the chat or anything that kind of Deborah said that's kind of made you kind of contemplate something that's going on in your schools or what you want to do with English going forward, please do share it in the chat for others to see also. But for now, we'll move on to Chris. Just have to make sure this is moving on for me. Lovely. So Chris Curtis is going to now talk about what the findings mean for the English classroom. So let's think about the practicalities, Chris.
Thank you. Yes, good afternoon, everybody. Right. So I sort of had the same sort of feelings as Deborah. I was quite impressed with some of the angles that it's going for, where the direction is going, because I've been part of some discussions with other people about where we should go with English, because I think we're all in agreement that things should change and lots should change. And what I can see is some green shoots. However, alongside that, there are reservations that I've got as a head of department, but also as a full-time teacher, and thinking, what is the impact? Because a lot of the changes, I can't see that much coming out of Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4 to accommodate some of these things. And so I can see that they've made thoughts about Key Stage 2, and I'm happy for that. And I'm really, really pleased that they're thinking about doing stuff at Key Stage 2. But I don't think it's there for Key Stage 3. And I think we've talked about for numerous years the wasted years of Key Stage 3, but we haven't got anything concrete in terms of this document about what's this going to look like. And also, as much as say it's green shoots, I can't see that much tangible at Key Stage 4 as well, because I think, although it mentions diversity, it's still saying that it's not going to add to the content, but it hasn't intimated what is it going to change in the content. So I'm interested to see how that's going to be. So for me, I've kind of got the same sort of feelings as Deborah. It's great. The intention, it's good. It's kind of the right direction. However, how that's going to be applied in the classroom is going to be yet to be seen. So I've just put it into a couple of headings, my thoughts and feelings of things. So on the first thing, I'm really pleased about oracy. We've talked about this for a number of years. We've been battering our heads against a brick wall about trying to get more of it in there, trying to look at how we can get students to value the speaking and listening assessment at Key Stage 4. The fact that it doesn't include anything to their overall grade, it really has undermined it, made it really, really difficult. So, and as that problem comes in, if it's not assessed, by default, what happens is other things take priority, the things that are assessed. And so we've seen that disappear and dwindle over there. So I'm really pleased to see that. And obviously, oracy is a big word at the moment. Everybody's chucking it around, but that concept of what is oracy and how it is in the classroom is something that I think that we need to be upskilling teachers with, because even from my limited experience, so I've been teaching about just over 20 years and thinking my PGC course, I didn't have that much training on oracy. And so at the moment, we have a workforce that kind of really needs some upskilling to even talk about it. Now, I've been lucky because I've taught A-level language. So a lot of what I've picked up about oracy has come from a linguistic aspect. If we're talking about things like, Grice's maxims, whether we're talking about convergence, divergence, those sorts of things. I mean, and even turn taking. And so my thoughts generally about this oracy is that I think we need to have a better conversation about what does that look like in the classroom, and not necessarily how we're going to assess it, but also sort of ways that we can support students. And talk about Debra about grammar, the grammar of oracy, and the rules and the choices that we make. We need to have some conversations about how we can support teachers to teach those rules around speech. It's not just grammar that we're talking about in writing, it's the grammar of speech and things like that, and it's also, simple things. I would say that, COVID has created this vacuum where we do have, a generation of students who struggle to articulate, to form opinions, but also to listen to a conversation, to track a conversation, and those sorts of things. So I think from that oracy, it's great, but I think we need something. And I don't want something very dogmatic and go, to be in a conversation, you need to do this, this, and this, which, as we know, when you become with prescriptive grammar, it gets too far. But I want teachers to have understanding of concepts around things like convergence and divergence, just as examples, so that students know that, look, if I want to build a relationship with somebody, I'm going to mirror the way that they speak. Or if I'm going to go a little bit dramatic, I'm going to use divergence for that there. So it's that sort of thing, and that meta language, but also the pedagogy around teaching oracy is something that I feel that we need a little bit more in there. Added to the oracy, which kind of links into that, is this use talking about drama. Now, my background is drama. I did drama and literature at university. And so I'm really, on one level, really, really pleased about that it's got there. But the one issue I've got is that texts. It's all right saying we're going to put drama, and that is one of our key industries in the United Kingdom is our media. That whole the arts, and I think some of the texts that we've got at Key Stage 3 that are used, we've got texts that are written for the classroom, not real texts. And so a lot of the problem that I've got around that drama is that it could be the case of having texts from many moons ago that actually they don't work, because what they've done is they've just taken a classic text and they've just had somebody, I'm going to turn this into a play, which is not a real drama script. It's a form of drama script, but it's not real in terms of what I would say a performance itself. So which is why In Spectacles has been so popular at Key Stage 4, because it's real, kids are engaged with it, it's really, really interesting. So for me, is the sticking point. It's yay drama, but what is it going to be? It's because there isn't that many texts. And I'll tell you, I've read lots. I've read lots from lots of different publishers that have been aimed for the Key Stage 3 classroom, and they are just, without naming names, they are quite appalling, and they're hard to use because they're not real texts. And so they're not playing around with the stuff that dramatists do and things like that. So that was the one sort of thing I had. And that may be just because I'm a drama sort of buff at heart. The other thing as well, and Debra mentioned about it, about the use of multimodal text and that, and ephemeral text. And I think that's really, really good, because what we've moved towards is this very much non-fiction is literary non-fiction. And so if you look at all the GCSE texts, they are non-fiction literary texts. So they are when an autobiographer is writing in a literary style. It's not playing around with those rules and doing that. So for me, it's really, really good. However, what I want to be really clear is I want Key Stage 2 to be about informing students of the different genres and allowing Key Stage 3 and 4 to be playful with those genres. So we introduce them, because a couple of years ago, we had the infamous triplets, which is a way to kind of challenge and hold us all down to, and I remember at Key Stage 4, we were going, am I writing to imagine, narrate or describe, or am I explaining, argue, persuade? And so we got so caught up in the language around it that actually we didn't go, right, we're going to write a piece of non-fiction now. It's going to be this, and you're going to try and shock somebody. You're going to try and do this. We got so hung about it. So what I hope is that Key Stage 2, they keep that, because I think it's a really good place to introduce different text types, to get to familiar with features, so that when we get to Key Stage 3, we can then look at the subtleties, the nuances, and developing those ideas in terms of that. So in terms of that, I'm quite happy. However, the other aspect that again, this is a practical kind of teaching aspect, because I think when we've seen in the past media text being used, the way that it's been taught is it's been, let's look for fact and opinion. So let's have a look at fact and opinion, and let's have a look at bias. And so for me, the issue I've got around that is actually we want them to be critical readers. So if they're going to be critical readers, I need to know more than facts and opinion and bias. Okay, and what I need them to know is how actually omission can create meaning and actually can influence people by not mentioning something. The whole idea of supposition, how in an argument you can suppose something, there's no grounding from it. So there are lots of things that I think we need to be looking around the media language, and not just being simplistic, because this is where I think we need to build them into being more critical. It's not just going what's true and what's not true. It's actually interrogating and understanding the mechanics behind things. This idea of dehumanizing in texts, in newspaper articles, it's something more sophisticated. And so what we did see before the changes, when we had media text at Key Stage 4 in the exams itself, is we did tend to see it tended to be boiled down. And I attended exam board training on this as well. It tended to be down on facts and opinions. And really, if you were at the top, it was students who spotted contradictions. Now, I'm going to say that, in our media world at the moment, there's a bit more than all those things there. So it's that for me that I want to be very, very clear. But the other thing is, again, is budget. How are some schools going to build in this media? I mean, I would love to get students creating newspapers and doing that, but trying to get hold of a computer lab for a day or to do that is the problem and the logistics. And so it's trying to think about that and how to do that and that and working on there. Just some other points, and I'm conscious that obviously I don't want to take over there. Grammar, I applaud everything they've done in terms of reducing the grammar, making it about writing. My question is, where are they going to put it in key stage 3 or 4? What are they going to do with it? Because I just think, all right, it's moving. Are they doing anything with it? It's not saying anything at all. So I think there's something we need to know about in terms of that. Just two other things, really. I just felt that it was really good to see the voices and that element there. However, I'm not sure what it amounts to. And again, a lot of this is green shoots, but I want concrete because it's what I work on. And for me, I would say that, I want them to be a bit, how to say this? I want to be a bit sort of confident and say, look, what we're going to do is we're going to rotate texts at GCSE every 5 years. And we are going to give schools a list of texts or exam boards, a list of texts, and they are going to rotate and they're going to move on and off. And I've called for this for a number of years because the problem is somebody's teaching in spectacles and they've always taught in spectacles and they always will unless there's something that's moving it. And I think if we're going to get, and the worry I've got at the moment is you've got a group of teachers who have only taught the same texts for 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years. And what we're getting, and I think that it will force us to be a little bit kind of de-skilled as teachers because, I only teach in spectacles. I only teach Romeo and Juliet because I've only taught. And we're not giving teachers those opportunity to kind of do different text. And I think we have it at A level. Why don't we have it at GCSE? That's one thing. So yeah, so some green shoots, certainly, but it's the logistics and it's the concrete elements and how is it going to be? And I'm worried that the way that it could go is how it has been before, which has been watered down and simplified to make it easier for people to teach rather than addressing the complexities of language. Because let's not forget, English is a beautiful, rich language and it's a beautiful, rich subject. And actually, you can't compartmentalize everything and you need to have that nuance, that understanding and working from that angle there. So anyway, there's my thoughts on it.
Thank you so much, Chris. And whilst you were speaking, quite a few comments were coming into the chat. I think you and Rebecca were constantly at the same point because as you spoke about where's the space in the curriculum for these new elements, there was a comment put in about, or 2 comments put in about space and something new, what's going to go. And there was also comments about budget and buying new play scripts or buying any new texts and where the budget is going to come from, the practicalities of a new qualification coming in. I'd also love to hear people's responses to your suggestion about the rotation of texts and how people would feel if kind of texts weren't available to be taught. And what you said just then about teachers having taught the same text for a number of years, it's also something to note that these many of the teachers currently have only known this qualification from their own education. They were taught it themselves, have gone through A-level degree, PGC, and now are teaching the same qualification they were taught. So they're not knowing of what there was before is quite an interesting point. But I would love to see other people's comments on that. And thank you to Barbara for highlighting that the English Media Centre have their review of the CAR and the English perspective. And I know the English Association also have our, and NATE's, and many other of our subject associations, and Lit Drive as well. So you can definitely find perspectives and summaries of the English curriculum assessment, the English aspects of the curriculum assessment review. Okay, I'm going to catch up on other messages in a moment, but I'll hand over to Yamina. I'll just move us on. So Yamina's going to try and put herself in the perspective of students. But I think, knowing kind of from the students that you've taught and what this could mean. So what do the findings mean for the students of English? So over to you, Yamina.
Thank you so much for having me. I just echo everything that Deborah and Chris have said. I think so much of that resonates with me, but I know also colleagues who've taught English and but also been students of English. I think that's one of the key things that everybody has been a student of English language and literature. And when I started thinking about how I might do this, put myself in the shoes of our young people, it's quite hard actually. But I started thinking about, well, from Key Stage 2 and then Key Stage 3, actually we haven't spoken about the national reading test. This is something that the government want, and it is going to heavily impact us as English teachers, and it will impact our time. And we have to just be honest about that. Anybody who remembers the Year 9 SATs, I mean, I was just at the start of my career, I should say, but we know that can be really time consuming. However, one of the positives is that there will potentially be kind of that clear identification of reading difficulties. There's an opportunity here to use those reading tests potentially for fluency and comprehension, to identify those young people who might be finding difficulties in English language or reading, and then to be able to close that gap. So from an equity point of view and a social justice point of view, which Deborah mentioned, that's a starting point. And I know schools are already doing so much, such as Accelerated Reader, Sparks Reader. There's so much out there. They're starting to do that work already, and actually perhaps having a systemic or systematic or consistent approach to that national reading test might help provide that consistency that we've perhaps been looking for as English teachers and English leaders as well. I really welcome the kind of focus on oracy. Anybody who's ever heard me speak knows that I'm a bit obsessed with oracy. And I like Chris, it's great that that's strengthened at Key Stage 2, but and the fact that our young people right from Key Stage 2 will access that is fantastic. But I think also how will that be implemented in Key Stage 3 and then Key Stage 4 is really important, and how do we develop that? And from what I recall in the car, the oracy kind of definition, that's an important one, but ultimately what we're talking about here is a framework, and what do we mean and understand by that? And we know organizations like Voice 21 have done some fantastic work, and that commission that was chaired by by Jeff Barton and the Oracy Commission did some fantastic work on that. So I hope that what that will mean is that the government and this will actually really lean on that, because the work is already there for both English teachers but also for the government as part of this national curriculum, especially if they're saying that they want that explicit teaching of talk, discussion and presentation, which I wholly welcome. And I think for our students, it's incredibly important to close that disadvantage gap. That's one of the key things that particularly young people from disadvantaged backgrounds or particular protected characteristics might not always have access to. It can be the thing that it is a difference between them achieving, well outside of kind of GCSEs and outside of school, and perhaps not. And for some young people from perhaps a kind of more privileged backgrounds, that's just something that they grow up with potentially. So if we can really, if the government and the car really does put this at the center and does do what it suggests it's going to do, then I think this could be really powerful and empowering for our young people and the students for future society, not just for what's happening in school. And it just reminds me of when I was in school and we had the speaking and listening when it was assessed, 20, 30 odd years ago, when I was a secondary school student myself. I actually really thrived as a student being able to showcase my speaking and listening skills. I had dyslexia. It wasn't something that was diagnosed until I was later on. And actually being given a grade, an A star for GCSE speaking and listening, meant that I was able to improve my grades, in English language as well. Whereas with the 2014 curriculum, it took that away, didn't it? It took away the kind of it became an endorsement rather than something that was graded. And therefore, by not grading it, we gave it less relevance. And that's not teachers' fault. That's not English department's fault. We just were time poor. That time poverty is so important. So it's really great to see that there is going to be a focus on oracy. I'd love to see it be something that is assessed, because I think once you assess it, then it is something that is given relevance with English departments. And I know lots of people are very cautious about that. And I know that, one of the reasons why it was taken away from that curriculum was because of some being accused of game playing and creating a far greater disadvantage, I guess. But it's just something I would love to see, because I do think it will help departments feel like they are allowed to and given permission to spend more time on oracy and speaking and listening. And I think the aspect of drama being part of it is just really exciting, and I love it. And I think it's really important for the students to feel that English isn't just this dead subject, and that's their words, this dead subject where they have to sit for 2 hours 15 minutes or 1 hour 45 minutes and write and write and write about things that they feel is irrelevant. And I think the next kind of idea that I want to make is that I do feel like this curriculum and assessment review seems to be exploring this idea of greater relevance for our students, for this modern this younger generation of students who actually are far more fluent in reading, writing, and obviously than we'd like to say. Like I was saying at I think I was at Pearson, but talking about how, they're very easy and eager to share their thoughts and ideas on TikTok about anything and everything. And yet they come into the classroom and they feel like they're in this deficit. And actually, our young people bring so much more knowledge and experience than I think we like to give them credit for. And I hope that with this curriculum and assessment review, and in English particularly, that focus on multimodal text, on relevant text from young people, that they'll understand, because they can analyze a text message. Why did you not put a full stop on that, miss? Why did you put that smiley face instead of this? We used to have the spoken language, if anyone remembers it, spoken language component as well. And even though it was 10%, actually what I found, the students loved that aspect of analyzing their messages, being able to talk about the different types of texts, and really exploring that because they felt like it was relevant to them. And I do feel like this curriculum assessment review has given almost, I don't like to use the word permission, but it's opened up that space and that conversation to say that yes, language is communication. We can analyze how language works in different contexts and for different audiences, and let's explore that. And I really do hope that's what the national curriculum reflects. And I'm not saying to bring back spoken language study, but I loved it so much, and so did the students. And I think it's because of the greater relevance that it had on them, and the way they explored multimodal text. And Chris mentioned it earlier, but in the old GCSE spec, they used to have the analyzing the headline, analyzing the subheading, and it was quite tokenistic in some ways. And Chris is right, we'd sit there and they'd be like, oh, can we differentiate between fact and fiction and things like that, and facts and opinions. And actually what we need to do is bring life back, because as we've said, there's so much out there that young people are already privy to, they already have access to. It's about how we bring all of that relevant and modern kind of text and multimodal text into the classroom, so that they can see that English isn't just something that's about creative writing or writing an argument or to persuade, but it's actually far greater. And language is so beautiful, and there's so much that they can bring to it, that it's not something that is done to them, but it's actually something that they can analyze, that they can be critical of, because they do it all the time. And I think how we do that in the English curriculum is going to be really interesting, beyond the kind of performative or spot the technique, which I think has started to happen in this curriculum. Spot the techniques, let's try and get you the marks. And the fact that the exam time has reduced in itself is really positive, I think, for young people, for the students, because by reducing the kind of, I think they proposed a reduction of like at least 10% in terms of time overall GCSE exam time. That's going to be really important for our students who are already overwhelmed with the number of exams that they have to do. The English language paper 2 is 2 hours 15 minutes long. I'm sorry, the English literature paper 2 is it's a very, very long time for a young person to be sitting there and concentrate. I can't do it. I can't even concentrate for 10 minutes. So expecting our students to be able to do it for 2 hours 15 minutes, the longest, it's hellish. And if we as adults can't struggle in this modern age, then why are we expecting our young people to do it? So I think that is really positive. The review says fewer exam hours, more varied assessments within English and within different subjects. I think that's going to be really powerful. It's just how do we retain that rigor without diminishing that, and then really thinking about, I was thinking about students and the focus on the rebalance of reading versus writing, and what does writing actually mean, and having really kind of clearer links between those curriculum aims. So when we're thinking about critical reading and communication, what is it that they're examining, and is it going to reflect what we've been teaching them, or is it going to yet again be another tick box thing that we say to the students, if you do A, B, and C, that will get you the 3 out of 4 marks, or whatever it is. And I think it's really important for us as teachers to reflect on how we'll bring that curriculum to life, because I do think the car tries to rebalance the kind of reading versus writing demands. And just from an equity point of view, just because I have to mention it, it's great and it's fantastic that there is a mention of inclusive or representative curriculum. I think the fact that they had student voice on there is really important. And if you haven't read the car, they actually mentioned the fact that they spoke to students, and students themselves said, we don't feel like this curriculum is representative of us. And so that's fantastic that it's almost given permission to say, yes, we do need to make sure that our texts are more diverse, are more inclusive, are more representative, and yet still knowledge rich, and really thinking about, what do we mean by canon? What do we mean by cultural capital? And are we just reproducing the systemic racism and the systemic barriers that we've always had in the curriculum? And I was saying earlier, I do think it's great that the car has mentioned representation and inclusive and diversifying the curriculum. I just don't think it goes far enough to acknowledge how we've actually, for all of this time, reproduced racist structures by even talking about the canon, because the canon is centering whiteness, and that's just me. That's that. How do we really deconstruct that for our students? However I understand it, they did say it's evolution, not revolution. So I was kind of expecting it. But I think what this card does is it says to English teachers and English departments, you don't have to wait for anyone to give you permission. You've got the permission, go for it. And I think at Key Stage 4, if you look at some of the examples, they actually have tried to ensure there is wider diversity in the texts that they're using at GCSE. But Key Stage 3 has always been open, and schools still don't. The schools, some schools that I've worked with or know of, haven't always diversified or really looked at kind of representative curriculum. Why not? How is this going to be any different? Because Key Stage 3 has always been open. And this is why I wanted something that said, here's some things that you can do in Key Stage 3, and that kind of practical element I just don't think is there, which is what kind of others have mentioned already. But we really need some practical strategies, because then what you get is this kind of loose approach that everybody just does everything that they want, and actually nothing is really consistent. It's not high quality, and what we don't want is performative or tokenistic inclusion or representation. We want it to be deep, we want it to be thoughtful, and we want our young people to be critical learners. And I think that's what they want to. They've said it in the car. The curriculum and assessment review made it really clear that they heard from the students, and this is based on what the students have said. So it's really, I think, if the students are saying this is what they want, then we need to think as teachers and leaders, how can we make sure that it really is beyond the performative and beyond tokenistic kind of inclusion and representation as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yamina. I don't know if you were keeping an eye at all on the chat, but your mentions about spoken language study got a lot of positive responses. And it was quite interesting, very, very positive, but not as controlled assessment. And obviously, just to highlight two things. First of all, the car does make a point that there's going to be no increase in written coursework. So that seems to give a message that there isn't any likelihood of return to NEA coursework in English. It does also say, however, that it will look at the appropriate assessment method for the skill being assessed. So, arguably there's something there about speaking, but it doesn't say anything about spoken language endorsement, speaking and listening. We don't have any information on that area. It emphasizes, obviously, absolutely, it mentions that in English language, all forms of communication, and in brackets, including spoken language, are to be analysed. So spoken language will be coming back as something. But there's a lot of details that, as you've all been mentioning, you're not quite clear how far things are going, and there's a lot more still to find out. And I'm looking at other comments. I don't know whether Debra or Chris, you want to come in at all, or you've had any kind of thoughts prompted whilst I explore the comments that have been shared.
Can I just come in?
Yeah, if you don't mind, Debra. Yes, I'm just kind of quickly reviewing chats.
Yeah, because I think the comments in the chat are really important, because they kind of chime with the things I was saying about, everything depends on how things are implemented, but also not just how they're implemented, but how do schools have the time to respond to the implementation and shape it in their own curriculum. And in some cases also, what about the resources that are required to expand to teach different ways, different texts, different approaches. So, and I think that's a really important comment, that schools can't just literally change instantly. They've got to have time and resource to do that. We need to remember that.
And that echoes, I'm just reading Sam's point, that kind of schools haven't opted. Oh, wait a minute, it's all skimmed down, right? Let's be fair, there's fair to schools. The reason why Key Stage 3 never gets the time for a full revamp is because there's never time. Schools haven't opted to simply ignore diversity. They simply haven't had the time, breathing space, or budget to be able to do so. And, you know, it's kind of, and I know you mean you're kind of very aware of kind of the issues that schools are facing. But in terms of kind of representing that student voice and what they have said they wanted, it's an important aspect to remember. Chris, did you want to come in at all?
I'm just sort of echoing. I'm just having a look at some of the chats that are at the bottom there. I mean, one of the things that I mentioned in the chat box was the spoken language investigation element of the old GCSE was one of the most interesting and kind of fruitful kind of things. And Yamina just mentioned it as well. It was just, I was talking about, there was an EMC resource that was about mechanics. And I remember us spending time exploring how mechanics speak to each other and how they talk differently to when they talk to a customer. And it was just, and it was real world texts that we were talking about. And it was quite it was quite a fairly cheap resource to do. But it was one of those things that I think it's giving students that opportunity to see English in not just being a poem or a novel that they've got to read. And I think it's that opening up English as a subject, which I really think needs to be thought of in line with this as well. Because I applaud the drama, I applaud that, and the oracy, but it's how we're using English. And it's not, and I think the problem that I've got, and this is why I think it's so important for students, as I said, I've got a daughter who's hoping to go to university to be a journalist, and if we think about what experiences she had in the classroom that's helped her to be like a journalist, and I think she hasn't under this new curriculum. She hasn't really, unless she's going to study some Dickens or, to report on the latest Dickens novel or, there's nothing there, is there? So I just think that engagement with language and the engagement with speech, writing, reading, it's those sorts of things that I think we need to put at the heart of what we're doing. And that's why the woolliness for me needs something. I want something a bit more tangible to work with. And that's why I think the spoken language element, just thinking about it, I mean, I was reminded about the mechanics thing and people joking in the chat box. It was such a joyous thing. And I remember that. And I remember, and it was it's one of the beauties of literature and all English is that it can include everybody. And it did, it was just, and I wouldn't necessarily think it would, thinking, shall I plan a unit on, let's do it on mechanics in a garage, talking. And it was just one of those things. And I think inclusivity is partly about diversity, but also it's about including everybody and that common discussion about language and language related things. And I just think we need to kind of think about how that's going to be in the classroom. So I've probably gone off topic. I'm sorry.
No, not at all. And I think Barbara was very pleased that you've mentioned the mechanics that she recorded in her local garage. I'm seeing some messages about post 16, so I just want to address these before we kind of move on any further. So what does the car say about post 16? First of all, in terms of those aspects of 19th century literature or 19th century texts, which are problematic for all students, but even more inaccessible for those students who haven't yet achieved grade 4 or having to resit at post 16. It seems clear that the car is saying that there needs to be more clear sky between language and literature, and that those aspects of literariness in the text shouldn't be replicated. It doesn't tell you exactly how it's going to happen, but it seems to be that, you know, that language will be more focused on the language and maybe more modern texts. And therefore the English language resit, if they are continue to resit the same GCSE, will therefore be a slightly different beast than what it currently is. There's also something to be said about, as Yamina and Chris can something more engaging and relevant. This kind of, if spoken language is going to be included, and it means that it's something that represents all types of students, all kind of walks of life, all vocations. It's not just about doing English to get to your A level and knowing the stuff for A level. It's actually about learning about your own voice and how you express yourself and how you use your voice in different ways, in different contexts. That is something that's going to hopefully be much more relevant to our post-16 students. And of course, there is also the post-16 skills paper and the mention of an additional qualification, kind of termed a stepping stone qualification, a level 1 qualification. So for any students who haven't achieved a grade 3, that they would then have an extra year, as far as I understand it, to do this other qualification before then moving on back to the GCSE route. There's a lot that's been suggested, but we haven't kind of got any more detail about it yet, and we're obviously eager to kind of find out more detail. So I hope that kind of gives a bit of a roundabout summary for our post-16 colleagues in the room also. I'd be interested to see how you respond to that. I'm just going to see if there's lots of comments have come in whilst I've been talking. So interesting question. I don't know. I'm going to pose this back out to Chris, Debra, or Yamina. With so many students now using Gen AI, how can we approach this alongside the English curriculum? Is this something that we can do in our English class? Is this something that we should be aware of and talking to students about? Or is it about learning how to do the best kind of prompts for Gen AI? I don't know if anyone's got a view on that.
Shall I say
Yes, please,
something,
Debra.
Ava?
Yes.
Yeah, I think I would include the generative AI aspects as, partly around the notion of the ephemeral texts that the report talks about, and really, it's really about that interrogating, playing with, exploring what it can do, and how do you check it? Because my experience of using AI is that often it looks really good, but then when I really check it, it's got quite a lot of mistakes or errors, but it's also quite, you can play with it and make it do creative things. So I just think that it's building it into that sense of exploring language critically and getting children, getting young readers and writers and speakers seeing what it can do and being critical of it at the same time.
Thank you. I'm seeing a few more comments. So Rebecca Hawkins, I think we need to focus more on a journey from Key Stage 3 to Key Stage 4. We don't need to wait until Key Stage 4 to build an inclusive curriculum. So absolutely kind of, as Yamina was saying, there is space in Key Stage 3 to have kind of make your own choices. But I also saw a comment from Rebecca White about bringing in a new text only to find out that your feeder school has just brought in that text also, and therefore you can no longer use it. So, best laid plans. We have Jonathan mentioned about the need for heads of department to have support and resources and how to develop strategically across several years and to make sure that they're upskilled, because obviously some of them will not have gone through curriculum reform or might not realise the impact and the planning that might need to be involved to not just change your GCSE curriculum, but of course you'll be reflecting on your Key Stage 3 curriculum and how it builds your student skills towards Key Stage 4. Please, Yamina, Chris, Debra, step in at any point. I'm just trying to make sure I've covered any.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that about how that exam change thing. I mean, this is scary now. I think I've been through about 14 different types of GCSE and English language and literature crossing boards and things like that. So when we had the big change before the last one, I think I was with AQA. And so what they did is they rolled out several free training days that we took the whole department to. And that was about looking at the new specification, but also how that could be fed through. So I think I certainly know, because I work with AQA quite a bit, is I know that AQA and other exam boards will be doing sort of similar things, which is kind of looking at how to map it out as Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4. Most exam boards, well, in fact, all do that. They don't see them as this discrete sort of end of. It's the journey itself that's building on there. So I'd say there isn't to that. That's where I think things like organisations like Lit Drive, also NATE as well, will be about supporting, and I'm sure EMC will be. I think what we're in this really strange phase at the moment where nothing's concrete, and so you can't really offer support at the moment until we know what's concrete in terms of those changes. So I think at the moment, what you'll see organisations supporting and helping each other. And dare I say it, Team English on Twitter, or X as it used to be, we're very, very supportive. And I know that a lot of English teachers are on social media that will help out. And so when we come to this change and the logistics have come through, I know lots of people will be able to help out, because I think it needs people to sit down and talk about it. Nobody's got it fixed, nobody's got it sorted out. But I do think that, when the finer details and the changes come in, I think we will talk about. Yamina and I will be online somewhere, won't we, talking about it and thinking, right, this is what we're going to do. Because I think that's the beauty of English teachers, and I know Barbara's about in the chat box as well, is that we talk about things and we kind of roll ideas off each other. So I think there is usually a good support network nationally on lots of different social mediums for that, to help with that. So hopefully that reassures on the situation.
Thank you. Yes. And we've also got questions about the timing for all of this. And nothing is concrete, nothing is set in stone yet. As far as I'm aware, it's obviously, we've had a curriculum assessment review reports, we've had a DfE response to it. The next stage would be, well, there's two things happening. There's the development of programs of study, which cover the Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4 kind of English curriculum. That's everything that you should be covering. And that is different to a GCSE specification, which is what you need to cover for a GCSE. Now, the specifications, they will have to be developed from subject content. There is no subject content yet. We have to work with DfE and Ofqual, and it will be a case of discussing as board, awarding organisations will discuss with them their proposals, and then that goes out to consultation. So you will be well aware of what is going to be proposed to be the content of GCSE specifications in advance of anything happening. At the moment, we think the timeline is something like a first sitting of a new GCSE in English maybe in 2029. Okay, so that's September 2029. To give you kind of perspective, I've got a son in year 6, and he will be the first cohort who will be doing that qualification in year 10. So that's kind of the timescale we're looking at. But obviously, as awarding organisations, we would want something developed and accredited a year in advance of 2029. So kind of working backwards. And there's a lot of conversation to happen. So somebody asking, when are we going to be writing a new spec? We are already thinking and researching and discussing what it could be. But until we have any clarity from the DfE and Ofqual about subject content, assessment objectives, it's all guesswork for us as well. I don't know, but Deborah or Yamina want to come in. I know we're nearly at time. So any last thoughts?
I was just going to add that there is so much already out there, particularly with people talking about time poverty and diversifying the curriculum. People like Benny Carr has just written a book on diversity in the curriculum, and there's a specific chapter all about English and how you might do that in English. If you look at Jennifer Webb's website, there's a whole book set of books that are just from diverse backgrounds. And so there is stuff already out there. And like Chris said, social media is just so powerful in sharing. I'm on LinkedIn. I am still on X, and I do share a lot of my resources on there still, because I think some of Team English are still there. And so it is, it is a collaborative approach. You're not going to be alone. None of us are alone in this. We're all in it together, I guess, in our confusion and our hope. So yeah.
Thank you. We will get back to people about dates if we got more clarity. My understanding on a draft timeline that is first teach or GCSE 2029, so first assessment will be 2031, but that is very much our understanding of things, and we may not have it perfectly spot on because we haven't been fully informed. Okay, we're at time. I want to make sure there's a slide for questions, but obviously we've been going through the questions already. And just generally, thank you for everyone who's come along and contributed, for all your thoughts. Thank you again to Debra, to Chris, and to Yamina for giving us a really quick review in your perspectives on the car, because there is a lot to digest. So I think it's been really helpful to hear your different perspectives. If anyone wants to follow our Let's Talk English campaign and to make sure you're informed of any further webinars that we have, any meetings or research that we're conducting, please do follow the link so that you can join us on our campaign, which will be running the whole year. And otherwise, thank you so much. And I hope you have a really good evening and a really kind of quiet December where you don't get a cold like me. So apologies for the tissue appearing. But thank you so much, everyone, and good night.